the lockdown on Tuesday.
It feels the same.
To give us the good oil afterwards. Probably won't mention the budget very often, but there's lots of activities that take place around that. So without any further ado, please welcome Rick Morton. Thank you.
G'day everyone. Thanks for having me. This is great. Thanks to the organising committee of the Writers' Festival for inviting me in the first place, for making me feel so welcome. To my mum, Deb, who I love, and Father Peter, who printed out my speech for me when I finished writing at 5:45 p.m. today. Thanks. Writing's quite hard. It's not going down a coal mine hard, but its terror is psychological. It is the only vocation of which I'm aware that you can get into because you feel like you can, only to be convinced in the act of doing it that you very much can't. And yet on you go, because the alternatives, hard labour, sterile office work, good pay, are worse. When we were younger, my brother and I would go out into one of the paddocks on the cattle station to get a killer. This is what we call slaughtering a fat bullock and butchering the carcass. While Dad did the actual work, my brother often rushed in with a pocket knife and whipped out the cow's bladder like a deregistered surgeon high on Adderall. And then he would make me play soccer with it. Now, under no circumstances am I a fan of playing soccer. But as I stood there, all of 6 years old and covered in cow wee, I thought to myself, I don't much care for this. I'm not claiming this as a defining moment in my career education. That came much later when I mistakenly came to believe that journalists were very rich. But it did get me thinking. I flirted with the idea of becoming an opera singer, though was blessed with neither the talent nor the audience. I might have been a doctor, but having already held the bladder in my hands, changed course early. Paleontology seemed the best way of marrying my love for dinosaurs with my deep affection for big and unwieldy words. They even named the thesaurus after one. The only discovery I made in this fledgling venture was not a new species of extinct animal, but that the discovery of a new species of extinct animal involved a lot of scraping about in the dirt under a harsh sun. No wonder they fucking died, it's hot out. If I couldn't have dinosaurs, I'd take the next best thing, the print media. The truth is, I wanted to write. I didn't know you could make it as a living as a writer, but I knew that I could do it. Mum tells the story of the moment she first realised I had taught myself to read in secret, which must have been unsettling. You spend all that time raising a child, and all of a sudden they're plotting against you, completing their own schoolwork, learning the language, raising a small army of 26 letters, half a dozen basic points of punctuation. Why does anybody want to write at all? As Gabriel Garcia Marquez said once, if you're going to be a writer, you have to be one of the great ones. After all, there are better ways to starve to death. So much pressure. Most writers I know now are so ill-equipped for life as to be almost incompatible with it. Like a microbe on a comet hurtling into the Earth's atmosphere, blessed with a total, unique and stratospheric view of this magnificent existence, but almost certainly doomed to incinerate on the way down. I spent so much time in my own head, I had Australia Post redirect my mail there. This, above all else, is why writing is not just something I wanted to do, but something I needed to do. The world was often confusing and intimidating. Social situations threatened. Disruption in my routine was overwhelming. For many years, I spent more time watching the world than I did participating fully in it. It's amazing what you can pick up. Though some would argue I come from a family of hoarders. How the chickens going, Mum? Mostly odds and ends in the shed, curios and artefacts, tea towels, teaspoons and cables, different coils of wire, spanners, spark plugs, cats, speeding fines. I chose to become a hoarder too, but for something less tangible. I studied the way people talk and interact with one another, the way the afternoon light plays itself out over a field or an ocean of rocks in Central Australia. Details, vignettes, funny or brilliant phrases that people have uttered in conversation, I wrote them all down. After a certain point, for hoarders of all kinds, someone comes along and asks, are you ever going to do anything with that, or should we just throw it out? And so, I write. I became a cadet journalist first, of course, straight out of high school at the Gold Coast Bulletin. Often journalism students will ask me how I became a reporter. The truth is naive and deeply embarrassing, but as a purveyor of essential truths, I am bound to tell it. Sure, I read as widely as my apprentice brain knew how, which was not at all widely, and wrote as often as I could, in as many outlets as I could. The Fassifern Guardian published my name in a letter to the editor I wrote in Year 7, the first time I had ever seen my name in print, and it felt kind of exotic. It felt like the Beach Boys song, Kokomo. My byline, that comma, ooh, I want another. I won't make you listen to that again, I promise. Anyhow, I did all of these things, but what I did most was actually write a daily affirmation. 25 repeats of the same line. I, Rick Morton, will become a journalist by the time I am 21. I wrote those lines for months and months in my final year of school, desperate to gain entry into the world about which I'd only dreamt. One of the first major stories I covered was the horrific and sad case of a man with schizophrenia who, while wielding a machete, was shot dead by police. The day after it happened, the officers involved were doing a reenactment, and my mentor in the office sent me to cover it. Just write down everything you see, he said. I filled my notebook, taking his advice literally, and for the next day's newspaper we produced a minutely detailed account of the shooting and gave some substance to what happened in this man's final hours. Any reporter worth their mid to low level pay packet will tell you that being a writer and being a journalist are two entirely different things. Many of us write in fractured sentences which are cleaned up by sub-editors, while they deride us all for butchering the English language, rightfully so. Some of them, I have been told, even keep a file of the worst offences, who I've never been allowed to see it. In journalism, the yarn is all that counts. The writing, for want of a better word, can always be cleaned up later. This is why many of us use the same words over and over. Punters, festival goers, revellers, depending on the occasion, are words on high rotation. Interest rates are hiked or slashed, and sometimes, in a manner that would most please Hemingway, they are just cut. Governments are frequently under pressure, while individual ministers are embattled, under siege, or eventually disgraced. Unless you are a meteorologist, I doubt you have had to find a way to describe wind speed as often as I have. Is the rain torrential, or light, or was it a squall, or cyclonic, howling, or roaring? There's probably been at least 150 weather stories in my career. They're still not over, I'm 31. Early on as a cadet, I vowed to use original language as often as I could. This became challenging on the 7th day of writing up the weekend dive and fishing reports. One of the great lessons in communication, which we must all encounter, is that sometimes saying visibility is 20 metres in a dive report is the sharpest way of getting the idea across, especially when the space is at a premium. Writers, like fainting goats, are easily spooked. Reporters are robust and brawling types, fond of confrontation and tension. Writers have souls so sensitive they cannot enter common bathrooms for the chemicals. Journalist souls, on the other hand, are made from the most pointless substance known to man: cynicism. You might have intuited this already, but I am not a particularly combative person. My ideal day is spent tending peace, watching the world go by, and, if trouble emerges, dealing with it hundreds of kilometres overhead from geosynchronous orbit. I am a writer trapped in journalism because it pays me a wage, which is rather like climbing into the lions enclosure at the zoo because they're nicer about eating you alive. So here I am, straddling those two worlds. In hindsight, there is a beauty in having written. I think I wanted something to live on beyond me, and I probably wasn't going to be having children, so a byline was the next best thing. It's entirely possible nobody will care about the pieces I publish after I'm gone, but it's the illusion that counts. In any case, one doesn't get into this business if we need to be loved. That ship has long sailed, taking with it the sheep and cattle that might have sustained your colony of affection. W.H. Auden summed up this approach with a sliver of arrogance. It would only be necessary for a writer to secure universal popularity if imagination and intelligence were equally distributed among all men. I much prefer the approach of my favourite writer, Kurt Vonnegut. Write to please just one person. If you open a window and make love to the world, so to speak, your story will get pneumonia. It takes a while, doesn't it? Journalists continue to be ranked below used car salesmen, lawyers and actual criminal syndicates in the trust stakes. And that's before anyone realises you've ended up working for Rupert Murdoch. Which I do. I've taken to my journalistic mission to be an outsider quite well, I think. Politicians cannot stand me. Tomorrow I will be filing my third budget leak for The Australian in a week. This kind of stuff drives the government wild because they hate anything disrupting the natural order of their preordained dissemination of information. It doesn't affect you guys, so it's all good. In the lead up to last year's federal budget, I wrote a series of front page reports on a brewing mental health crisis. Because I'm a terrible person on the phone, I ignored a series of private number phone calls 3 days after the budget was handed down. In a weak moment, I answered on the fourth day. It was the Health Minister, Greg Hunt. He said to me, "I just want you to know, and only for you to know, that if it wasn't for those 3 front page reports, I would never have received the go-ahead to get the $80 million in the federal budget." He'd argued with both the Treasurer and the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, but without success. He told me that when my third report ran splashed over the front page of The Australian, he received a WhatsApp message from Mr. Turnbull at 6:15 a.m. saying simply, "What do you need?" And then there was $80 million in the budget. It felt pretty good. Journalism is writing what someone, somewhere, doesn't want published. Everything else is public relations. But beyond that, my job, even in the last 6 years, has taken me around the country and the world. I've been based in Sydney, but held the bureau in Tasmania for 3 months, during which I was almost locked in a state forest on a remote northwestern tip of the state by an angry logger. Worked in Melbourne for a year, and just a few months ago I received a call asking if I would move to Canberra. They said it would only be temporary, and a week and a half later, in somewhat of a daze, I started work at Parliament House. It was just days after I'd broken the story about Barnaby Joyce living rent-free in a townhouse owned by a politically influential Armidale businessman. A week later, the Deputy Prime Minister resigned. When I saw him in Parliament that week, he glared at me and said simply, "Hello, Rick." "G'day, Mr. Joyce. Love your work." Life is strange like that. I've met a powerful source in a park, under a tree, and away from security cameras to receive a bundle of papers relating to a story I was working on. It was really cool. And I've been leaked highly sensitive departmental records from bureaucrats who followed my reporting on the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Clive Palmer has called me a North Korean spy. Though my reporting was not responsible for the Royal Commission into Child Sex Abuse, I was somewhat responsible for the timing of it. Before then Opposition Leader Tony Abbott had said anything in support of the matter, we received a tip that he was having coffee with a mate of his in Balmain in Sydney. Rarely, he had no gatekeepers and no media advisors present. A photographer and I hid behind a parking meter in the street, which is harder than it sounds. And when he arrived, I galloped in with my tape recorder out. He was caught off guard and came out in support of the Commission. That afternoon, before I had a chance to get my story up or for it to be printed in The Australian, he issued a statement saying precisely what he had told me. Hours later, with the support she knew she needed, Prime Minister Julie Gillard called the Royal Commission. I've also made some stupid mistakes, including printing the name of Tony Abbott's sister and confusing her with an Indigenous Affairs academic at the University of New South Wales. Tony Abbott's sister is not, need I point out, an Indigenous Affairs academic for the University of New South Wales. Nor, I should add, was the academic particularly happy to be summarily tied by blood to Tony Abbott. Sorry. I've confronted murderers, allegedly. I've been pursued by outlaw motorcycle gang members, which is a stunning way of really feeling alive. My reporting has helped people and it has helped me too. I've lost count of the number of times I've been sent without notice to some distant reach of the continent to gather a yarn, sometimes with just hours on the ground to turn up something. Once I was exiled without warning to Tamworth, landing at 3:30 p.m. By 6 p.m. we had a photograph and a story for the front page of The Australian. I have filed a news story more times from the seat of an airplane, in a Mexican standoff with the air hostess who was stalking down the aisle to demand all computers be switched off. What they want to tell you is that if you leave the computer on, the whole plane may plunge into the ground like a dart. What I want to tell them is this: Either way, if I cannot follow my story, I die. And it is far more pleasant going down with everyone else. My editors and chiefs of staff are fond of telling us without a hint of amusement, failure is not an option. I hear them when they say this. I do. But the laws of physics tell me that failure is always an option. The trick is to bring snacks for the journey. My first editor at the newspaper where I worked, Clive Matheson, gave me the best advice for both reporting and writing, indeed for life itself, in my first week there. He said to me, be hard-headed, not hard-hearted. We are, all of us, after the same fundamental thing, truth. Truth, like riding a bike, can be uncomfortable, but the exercise is healthy. I frequently come back to this line because I respect Clive and I respect this message. The other great line about writing is to write what you know. This has been mistaken as a commandment to write only within a field of expertise, but I think it has a broader meaning. One must write, deep down, what they feel and have seen of the world. Not even what they think they know, but the actual atomic sensation of truth at the most indivisible level. To get there, you must burrow and scratch and dig well beneath the surface. You must become a truffle-hunting pig, but for the truest thing you know. I know pigs are less favoured for the mission these days because hounds because they tend to eat the truffles once they've found it. The metaphor breaks down here, and I apologise, I just really liked the mental image. Reporters and writers are truffle-hunting pigs. I love reporting because I am at my most base a man in search of knowledge. And knowing things first is addictive. But last year I was offered the chance to become the writer I had long dreamed about. Louise Adler, the chief executive of Melbourne University Press and human version of a dramatic weather event, approached me after a column I had written and offered me a book deal. That was in May last year. We were seated at her usual table at Bambini Trust in Sydney's magazine district where publishing moguls go to do deals. And she offered me, this kid from Boonah, a chance to write a book. Naturally, I was excited. Within weeks, that excitement had turned to terror, which settled eventually into the background hum of crippling anxiety that has followed me for most of my life. Here I refer you to the great words of the writer Steve Healy. Writing a novel, actually picking the words and filling in paragraphs, is a tremendous pain in the ass. Now that TV is so good and the internet is an endless forest of distraction, it's damn near impossible. But that should be taken into account when ranking the all-time greats. Somebody like Charles Dickens, for example, who had nothing better to do except eat mutton and attend public hangings, should get very little credit. Steve is right. I've grown up reading about the writing routines of the great novelists in history. Without exception, it involves some application of a strict routine. Rise before dawn, go for a walk, sit down at the desk and write for 5 hours. Lunch, light afternoon reading, dinner, more writing. To the extent that it could be said I even had a routine, it was this. Several distinct but elongated periods of crying, punctuated by writing a few paragraphs before spending 2 to 3 hours wondering if today, hopefully today, was the day some world-ending extinction event was due to happen. I'm usually a man who loves his solitude and quiet time, but I took to inviting anyone and everyone over to my home for drinks. My friends, colleagues, a Jehovah's Witness, the painter, poor old Paolo. Come on in, I cooed to them, I've got nothing on. I feel like we're intruding, they would say to me. I'd grab them by the shoulders, fear behind my cold dead eyes, and beg them to stay. I've got canapes. On the day I was supposed to file my manuscript, which itself was 2 deadlines and a week after I promised the publishers it would be filed, I downed tools and went on a date. I was so desperate to avoid completing my book that I opted for personal growth and fulfillment instead. Which, for those of you who know me, ought to be shocking. My favourite writer on the subject of writing, Anne Lamott, gives this advice, the advice I should have listened to. Perfectionism is the voice of the oppressor, the enemy of the people. It will keep you cramped and insane your whole life. She elucidates the idea of a writer's anxiety so clearly by citing the poem We Who Are Your Closest Friends by Philip Laparte. It bears repeating. It's one of my favourites. We who are your closest friends feel the time has come to tell you that every Thursday we have been meeting as a group to devise ways to keep you in perpetual uncertainty, frustration, discontent and torture by neither loving you as much as you want, nor cutting you adrift. Your analyst is in on it, plus your boyfriend and your ex-husband, and we have pledged to disappoint you as long as you need us. In announcing our association, we realise we have placed in your hands a possible antidote against uncertainty, indeed against ourselves. But since our Thursday nights have brought us to a community of purpose, rare in itself, with you as the natural centre, we feel hopeful you will continue to make unreasonable demands for affection, if not as a consequence of your disastrous personality, then for the good of the collective. It is this creeping anxiety that powers me, like an outboard motor on a boat filled with bees, and the boat is going somewhere vaguely unsettling, perhaps Sydney or Wacol. I was going to say Boat Desert, but I didn't know if anyone was in the crowd. Hope not. To be honest, I feel like a bit of a wanker even calling myself a writer, but I realise this comes with the territory. I put it on my entry form when I went to New Zealand a few weeks ago and half expected to be hauled into customs for being a massive dickhead. The problem for us anxious folk is that the first draft of anything never bears any resemblance to the sublime perfection that was in your head. How cruel it is to have such platonic ideals in the ether of your own mind only to yank them into existence and see them for what they are. It's much like seeing pictures of a person you met the night before, labouring under the mistaken belief that this was not what you were destined for. The answer, of course, is editing, which is about as appealing to a writer as cholera. I have now read the manuscript of my own book about 23 different times, section by section, chapters out of order or in reverse order. Reader, after the third or fourth go around, it all begins to look like word salad. But this is the necessary work, the work that makes you, on the page, a better person. George Saunders is kinder about the process than I am. The interesting thing, he says, in my experience, is that the result of this laborious and slightly obsessive process is a story that is better than I am in real life. Funnier, kinder, less full of crap, more empathetic, with a clearer sense of virtue, both wiser and more entertaining. And what a pleasure that is, to be, on the page, less of a dope than usual. There are writers who talk about being visited by the muse, though she has certainly never appeared to me. Perhaps this is because I grew up in a house with at least 7 shotguns. Had she attempted to descend from her unearthly plane to inspire me, it would have ended in tragedy. I'd be the only writer in history due to receive some mystical influence, only to have the muse be mistaken for a trespasser and pumped with several rounds of Winchester. It would be just my luck. That's not to say I place no stock in the idea of being in a state so unguarded that the right words come to you, fully formed. This happens to me not when I'm sitting down at my desk, but usually as I'm about to fall asleep at midnight. One must scramble to write down these words or phrases, or, if you're lucky, entirely brand new thoughts, because they are only offered once. It's the opposite of closing down sale at Rugs A Million. At these prices, ladies and gentlemen, they really will be walking out the door. I'm not ungrateful for these experiences, but what I wouldn't give for the spark to arrive about lunchtime, after I've had breakfast, coffee, and finished my first allotted hour of crying for the morning. That's what nobody tells you, however. These moments cannot write a book for you, and certainly not a newspaper piece. Any journalist who waited for the right form of words before a looming deadline would be howled down for being so useless. Who needs a muse when you have editors stalking the newsroom floor, the print industry equivalent of Metamucil? It actually takes work, actual, hard, repetitive and mind-numbing work, as Ray Bradbury says, to find your way towards something honest, hidden under the trapdoor on the top of your skull. We are after precision above all else. What is the word that means most what we want to say? There's no room for the complication of adverbs, which Stephen King believes will have paved the road to hell, but the precise word in the right order. Noel Webster was a lexicographer working on the Great American Dictionary in 1806 when his wife came into the study and found his secretary on his lap. She said to him, "Noah, I am surprised." And the great lexicographer replied, No, my dear, you are astonished. It is we who are surprised. Or so the story goes. To write precisely, we need to have something to say. When we know what that is, we find ourselves reaching a point more efficiently, the better for communication. The American journalist William Safire long lamented the loss of clarity in prose. We hear speakers so conflicted in their complexity that they're in two minds about the word ambivalent. The world that used to yearn for a good 5-cent cigar now yearns for a simple declarative sentence. Nothing beats a subject followed by a verb that aims at an object. When I was in year 8, my then teacher, Kay Stegman, wrote in my report card that I had a tendency to be verbose. After looking up the word verbose, I decided I was indignant, galled, irked, aggrieved and vexed. I had mistaken writing for the abundant application of words. I never met a point at which I couldn't utterly fail to arrive. Maybe us writer types are more like Sisyphus, punished for our craftiness, pushing that boulder all the way to the top of the mountain, only for it to roll back down again. But in his own way, Sisyphus was editing that chunk of stone, whittling it down, making it smoother and more manageable. Maybe, at the end, he had a pebble, or an essential truth, something you could put in your pocket and keep for later.
Anxiety left a little. Does anybody have any questions on Rick that they would like to throw at him?
This is the easy part. How do you lose weight? Well, I've been asking myself for years. Anyone good?
Obviously, everyone is totally stunned. Or in a deep state of contemplative meditation.
Yeah, they're being
It's beautiful, right?
Here's a
Hello, Monica.
So your book's coming out in August.
June 30, yes, but August will be the.
And are you going to have a book launch here? Are you going to bring your book here?
I will bring myself here with my book.
boxes off.
If you had to have a quick sum up of what your book was about, what would that be? If you could just say, what is your book about?
You would presume this is something I'd actually thought a bit about. No, I can do it. It's just let me do it. It's fine. No, it's essentially it's a family memoir about growing up on the outside in Australia. Outside being geographical in terms of poverty, means, resources, access to culture, and all the rest of it. So I've thrown my entire family under the bus. Myself first, because I'm nice like that. Yeah, it all started, the book actually, I've got a book deal because Mark Latham abused me on Twitter. And I wrote a column about it because I was so angry. And then the publisher read it and she's like, you've got a book in you. She sent me a text. I'm like, well, sure. Mark Latham's name does not appear in the book. But I am going to thank him in my launch speech. Thanks, mate. Oh, he called me an elitist. I know. We thought a reading cinema was only subtitled. I don't know what his definition is. Because I was sticking up for Fairfax journalists who'd been made redundant. And because I was supporting Fairfax, he decided that I was an elitist, out-of-touch journalist. I pointed out to him that was all good and he can have that opinion, but I don't have an $80,000 a year public pension. And it would be super nice if I did. He never comes back to that one. He can't respond to it.
Have you run into anyone in Parliament House that knows of Boonah? Is from Boonah? What are those interactions like?
Well, here's the funny thing. So Boonah in Canberra is actually the word they use for bogan. They call everyone from Queanbeyan Boonahs. So whenever I tell them where I'm from, they just laugh. And then I stick up for Boonah, obviously, because I love it. I'm like, no, you should really come. Only if you're a good politician. If they're annoying, I'll be like, oh no, Boonah's terrible, don't do it. Don't come. That I actually don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would.
Where would you like them to be now?
I mean, here's the ideal, and it's probably about as unbelievable as the Yeti. But I would love to just keep writing books and be able to freelance, so I could write what I want when I want. But the reason that's extremely unbelievable is because I have no organisational capacity as a person. And if I was a freelancer, I would starve to death within hours. I'd put my first invoice in, and then I'd go and buy noodles from the store or something like that. But I mean, I'd love to move out of Sydney and just be somewhere pleasant and write books and like churn through a couple, and then just hopefully have something to sustain me to keep doing that, because that's what I like doing. I mean, I told you all it was terrible and I was stressed the entire time, and I was. And I can't make this comparison, but I imagine it's like childbirth, where you're actually designed like you're meant to forget it. So I'll just come back and do it again. I never said it was like childbirth. I said I imagine it was like childbirth. My sister's a midwife. Okay.
Would you miss, if you were to do writing full-time like that and books, would you miss holding politicians to account, given what you've done on front pages, $8 million, all the stuff?
I do like that feeling. I mean, journalism's hard because like it is like a bad drug. Like you keep coming back to it even when you have really bad days. Rory knows what I'm talking about, I'm sure. But it's like you think that you don't want to do it again, but then you get that one really great yarn. Journalists have this thing, because we all work in cubicles, and I call it meerkatting. Like when someone gets a good yarn, it's like they're up looking around for someone to tell before they've actually bothered to go and write it, because we just want to tell someone. Our natural instinct is to blab. And I love that feeling. I don't know what I would do without it, because it does make me feel relevant to a degree, and you're kind of a part of it. And when you look back on stuff and you be like, oh, okay, you actually did shape something for better or worse, it's a pretty cool feeling. And you can't really, there's no immediacy with book writing. I'd have to learn to adapt to the deadlines, I think. Maybe. So I'll quit cigarettes too.
Do you think there is any future, long-term future in print? Obviously, it's not going to die away completely, but I mean, can you imagine that there are going to be print journalists coming up in 10 years' time?
I think it will survive for now. The problem is you're coming off a really large base with these rivers of gold and classified advertising, and we were all incredibly plump in the old days. I started at the tail end of it, so I can't really talk. But I feel like, with something like The Australian, like we still have a really niche market, and it's something people are willing to pay for, because we do have policy journalists. I mean, I write about social welfare, social policy, ageing, disability, and I write about the NDIS, and I have done for 5 years, and there aren't many other journalists who are doing it, and I don't think there's any who've written as much about it as I have. So people are still willing to pay for stuff like that, but the advertising base is falling away for print. We're relatively lucky because we've still got what they call a premium market, so our ads are worth more, and we've still got more journalists than most people have, but I don't know how much longer that's going to last for, which is a real shame, because I have friends who work in digital media and they're chained to their desks for most of the day. They very rarely get to leave and go and meet people, which is how you get stories, and their workload is so high they're expected to churn out 4 or 5 stories a day, which sounds easy, but you actually don't get to spend any time, and you don't get to, when I get into work, I write 1 story, if I'm lucky, sometimes 2, and I can spend literally 7.5 hours of my day thinking about what I'm going to do, asking the right questions, reading the entire 300-page report if I have to, and I think that kind of journalism is shrinking away, which is a real shame. But anyway, buy the newspaper.
Do you have, when you talk about a different anxiety for writing, did you experience the same anxiety before you're on the drum or other TV commentary?
No, actually. I think I like Q&A things more. I think writing's more personal. Like you're actually putting something on the page that you think matters to some degree or another. I don't necessarily have it with journalism. I have anxiety about phoning people and stuff like that. But even when I write my story, there's no one's looking to grade you on how well it's written. I put effort into it, but my writing is something that I actually want people to like, and so there's the anxiety that they might reject it. But going on TV is kind of fun now. Like, I was nervous the first few times I did it. But I was telling, I've forgotten your name, I'm so sorry.
Alison.
Alice. And I was telling her before, when I first went on the drum on the ABC, I was quite bad because I was really worried about what my bosses would think of what I was saying. So the trick is I learned to not care at all and to just say what's on your mind. It's actually remarkably freeing. We should all try it. Try it tomorrow. And as soon as I did that, I was like, oh, well, I can say what I want, and it's obviously I'm not going to be an idiot, but it's more me rather than trying to be some silhouette of a company.
And because there you're there as Rick Morton, not as a journalist.
Well,
Sometimes you are.
in both capacities. So I'm there, like when I go on there, I'm there as Rick Morton from The Australian, so you don't want to be completely at odds, but I think there are ways of talking intelligently about all issues that don't necessarily tie in with any ideological agenda. Do you know what's really good and radical? Facts. Just tell people what happened. I wish we could do more of it, actually. Pretty fun.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Dessert is about to be served, and at this point I'd like to acknowledge and thank Mitre 10 for response to